It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Juhani Pallasmaa as part of this conference. Juhani, and I'll say only one thing about Juhani to introduce this, is again to do with profession and what we think we are. Juhani has been involved in many different ways of engaging with design and architecture, starting from phone boxes, and but also you've done some farmhand work, and you've been involved in writing and architecture theory, as well as social and discourse building. But you say quite meaningfully in one of your writings that you don't consider architecture as your profession. You consider it as a window through which you want to see and understand the world. So this is another way of building the metaphor of mapping and what axis of time would mean, and how do we create that window which is a tool for mapping that world and understanding more about it, and then equally to be able to share it, that vision. Juhani has called his paper Body, Mind and Architecture, and he's going to talk about the mental element and dimension and essence of the architecture. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Let me elaborate by a few sentences on my background. Yes, in addition to looking at the world through the window of architecture, my soul is fundamentally a farm boy's soul, because I spent my childhood during the war years at my farmer grandfather's small barn, and I was the only boy within 5 kilometers distance. So I had 5 years of time to invent something for myself to do, because in those days there were no books, no television, no radio, nothing. And I began to observe my surroundings, what animals do. All animals practically build something, etc. And my journey from that farm has continued through looking at things, and I get a little bit chills when I'm called a theoretician, because I do not really know what a theory of architecture could be. Architecture is such a complex, messy business that I don't think it can be caught within a single theory. But I'm looking at things, and all my writing, I think 55 books by now, are reports on what I have seen or observed. Now, and my journey has gone in a, how would I say, intellectual field, from anthropology through psychoanalysis to psychotherapy, at some point ethology, and then since the late 1970s, phenomenological philosophy, and more recently I'm doing collaborations with neuroscientists, and that is what my lecture tonight will be about, some aspects about about architecture and human mind, which is a new, rather exciting window or door again to the world, opened up for us architects and artists by neuroscience, particularly the 24-year-old discovery of mirror neurons and mirror systems begins to explain why art works so strongly on our minds, and how does architecture and settings, environments work on our minds. Well, I left a former title of my lecture here just to make the point that there is nowadays an Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which operates in La Jolla at the famous Salk Institute of Biological Studies, designed by Louis Kahn. And my first lecture on this topic was at the annual meeting of the ANFA, the Academy for Neuroscience on Architecture. Contemporary architecture has often been accused of emotional coldness, exclusive and restrictive aesthetics, and a distance from life. This criticism suggests that we architects have adopted a formalist attitude instead of aspiring to tune our buildings with realities of life. Don't we design our houses on the basis of functional and aesthetic criteria instead of imagining them as resonant settings and backgrounds for situations of lived life, or instead of intuiting the behavioral and mental interactions between spaces and their occupants? Let us assume a wall, what takes place behind it? The French poet Jean Tardieu asks provocatively. But do we, architects, have the same curiosity of life? Aren't we just interested in the wall itself rather than what takes place behind it? The weakness of a sense of life in contemporary buildings may not only result from a deliberate emotive distance or formalist rejection of life's nuances and complexities, but simply geometric configurations may be easier to imagine than the shapeless and dynamic acts of life taking place in them, or the ephemeral feelings invoked by them. Joseph Brodsky, the poet, makes a blunt suggestion to this effect when he writes in one of his essays, "The city of memory is empty, simply because for an imagination it is easier to conjure architecture than human beings." No doubt modernism at large, its theory, education as well as practice, have focused more on form and aesthetic criteria than the interaction between built form and life, especially mental life. It is thought-provoking that when you look at pictures of ideal cities, they are usually empty. Le Corbusier's architectural credo architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light, turned architecture into a visually autonomous art form. However, I must, in all honesty, add that Le Corbusier's work is very powerful metaphysical, and in his work, in most cases, the poet takes upper hand of the theorist and polemicist. The minimalist style of the past decades has tended to distance architecture even further from events of life. Again, I need to add that I believe in the value of reduction myself, as long as it is not the essence of the thing that is being reduced. When expressing my criticality of contemporary architecture, I want to emphasize firmly that I'm not supporting any nostalgic, Heimlich, or regressive architecture. In fact, our conservative consumer culture is primarily offering exactly such alternatives. I'm calling for an architectural thinking that incorporates life in all its practical and mental implications beyond the Vitruvian trinity. The reductive attitude to life denies its essential spontaneity and messiness and tends to turn life itself into formal and predictable behavior. Yet, as John Ruskin concludes, imperfection is in some way essential to all that we know of life. It is a sign of life in a mortal body, that is to say, of a state of process and change. Nothing that lives is or can be rigidly perfect. Part of it is decaying, part nascent. And in all things that live, there are certain irregularities and deficiencies which are not only signs of life, but sources of beauty. As I began my studies in architecture at the Helsingi University of Technology in the late 1950s, my professor Aulis Blomstedt, who by the way was the counterpole of Alvar Aalto in the Finnish architectural discourse in that era, used to teach us the talent of imagining human situations is more important for an architect than the gift of fantasizing space. These are just examples of my professor's studies in proportional harmony, the relationship between musical and visual harmony, and also the cosmic implications of architecture. Well, as we know, architecture very much initiates or originates in the attempt to relate the cosmic world, the world of the gods, with our human world. And that was very much mediated by studies in measures and proportional harmony. I do not know today any school of architecture in the world which would still teach Pythagorean harmonics, for instance, which is foundational to architecture. But this is how far architecture has been instrumentalized away from its original, and I would also say ontological task. The conscious interest of architects already in those years that I studied was directed to formal, visual, and compositional qualities of design, and I did not quite grasp the meaning of my professor's statement. It has taken almost 50 years, 45 years of practice and intense studies in architecture for me to really appreciate this attitude. Architectural spaces are not just lifeless frames for our activities. They guide, choreograph, and stimulate actions, interests, and moods, or in the negative case, they stifle them. Even more importantly, they give our experiences of being specific perceptual frames and horizons of understanding. Here I refer to existential understanding, not any kind of intellectual understanding. Every space, place, and situation is tuned in a specific way and it projects atmospheres promoting distinct moods and feelings. We live in a resonance with our world, and architecture mediates and maintains that very resonance. I might here add the rather fresh, recent neurological finding or argument, which is not very much discussed anymore. It's taken as a biological fact, neurological fact. Our environments change our brains, and our brains change our behavior. In the 60s, environmental psychologists argued or suggested that environments alter our behavior, yes, but that relationship is much, much more dramatic. Environments and architecture actually change our brains. Buildings are products of imagination. Every human structure has first existed as an intentional mental image. Isn't it quite depressing to realize that all the ugliness out there in our surroundings is a consequence of human thought? I have suggested already 30 years ago a psychoanalysis that would use architecture as the source for collective psychoanalysis of cultures, and nobody has really taken it very seriously, probably because it would be a rather shocking analysis. The results would be rather shocking. In my view, there are two qualitative levels of imagination. One that projects formal and geometric images, and another that also simulates the actual sensory, emotive, and mental encounter with the projected entity. The first category of imagination projects the material object in isolation, the second as a lived and experienced reality in our life world. In the first case, the imaginatively projected object remains as an external image outside of the experiencing and sensing self, whereas in the latter case, it becomes part of her existential experience, as in the real encounter with material reality. The neurological affinity between what is perceived and what is imagined has been well established in scientific studies. The fact that what we actually sense, see for instance, and what we imagine is processed exactly in the same places in the brain. So imagination and observation or imagination and seeing are very near each other. In fact, neurologically, it is argued today that there is no seeing, no sensing without a creative component. We live in a world that we actually create ourselves, project ourselves. There is no world out there as we think we see it. The formal imagination is primarily engaged with topological and geometric facts, whereas the empathic imagination evokes embodied and emotive experiences, qualities and moods. Mood and ambience, atmosphere are also terms that have now entered first philosophical interest and now increasingly in architecture schools. Modernity has been so obsessed with form that we have completely disregarded atmospheres, which seems to me are much more important for the real quality of environmental experience. Maurice Merleau-Ponty introduced the evocative notion of the flesh of the world to denote the lived reality in which we inseparably dwell, and the empathic imagination evokes multisensory, integrated and lived experiences of this very flesh. So what I'm actually suggesting to the architectural education and discourse here is the acceptance of the flesh of the world as the true context of our thinking. Henry Moore, the master sculptor, gives a vivid description of the simultaneous embodied, internalized, and imaginative externalizing power of artistic imagination. Artistic imagination, and I suggest also architectural imagination, is a two-way process of internalizing and externalizing. Thank you. This is what Henry Moore writes. This is what the sculptor must do. He must strive continually to think of and use form in its full spatial completeness. He gets the solid shape, as it were, inside his head. He thinks of it, whatever its size, as if holding it completely enclosed in the hollow of his hand. He mentally visualizes a complex form from all around itself. He knows while he looks at one side what the other side is like. He identifies himself with its center of gravity, its mass, its weight. He realizes its volume and the space that the shape displaces in the air. I hope you will remember this description by a master sculptor when I, somewhat later, will read you a passage of Mozart's compositional strategy. This precise account of a great artist suggests that the act of imagining spaces and objects is not solely a visual endeavor. It is a process of embodiment, identification, and feeling the entity as an imaginary extension of one's self through embodied simulation. This is the term that neuroscientists prefer to use nowadays, embodied simulation. The artist's body becomes a work, and simultaneously the work becomes an extension of her body. Again, a reversal or mirroring or exchange. Every creative person works unconsciously with herself as much as with materials, forms, sounds, or words. Einstein's famous confession of his visual and muscular thinking is an authoritative suggestion that all thinking has a component of embodiment. Imagination is not a quasi-visual projection. We imagine through our entire embodied existence. Thinking is actually a way of molding one's world as if it were sculptor's clay. Heidegger compared thinking with cabinet making. Yet Henry Moore adds a crucial comment on the role of the conscious intellect. When he writes, "The artist works with the concentration of his whole personality, and the conscious part of it resolves conflicts, organizes memories, and prevents him from trying to walk in two directions at the same time." The intellect provides the ground and control for the process, but the poetic image does not arise from reason alone. In his illuminating essay entitled "The Trout and the Mountain Stream" of 1947, Alvar Aalto valorizes his creative process and particularly the factors beyond rational consciousness when he writes, "The cause of the frustration in design work, I believe, is the complicated and intense pressure of the fact that architectural design operates with innumerable elements that internally stand in opposition to each other. All this becomes a maze that cannot be sorted out in rational and mechanical manner. The large number of different demands and sub-problems form an obstacle that is difficult for the architectural concept to break through. In such cases, I work sometimes totally on instinct in the following manner. For a moment, I forget all the maze of problems. After I have developed a feel for the program and its innumerable demands have been engraved in my subconscious, I begin to draw in a manner rather like that of abstract art. Led only by my instincts, I draw not architectural synthesis, but sometimes even childish compositions, and via this route, I eventually arrive at an abstract basis to the main concept, a kind of universal substance with whose help the numerous quarreling subproblems can be brought into harmony." I find Aalto's notion a universal substance thought-provoking, as it seems to refer to a general atmosphere or tuning of the work rather than any specific or concrete ideas. I wish to argue firmly that true qualities of architecture are not formal or geometric, intellectual, or even aesthetic. They are existential and poetic, embodied and emotive experiences which connect us with a deep historicity of dwelling in space. And they arise from our existential encounter with the work rather than vision. Artistic images are not pure formal configurations. They are images that are embedded in the soil of human historicity, memory, and imagination. Poetic images are always new and ancient at the same time. Like the Jungian archetypes, architectural images evoke recollections, feelings, and associations. Existentially meaningful architectural images cannot be mere formal fabrications or inventions, as they are bound to echo our mental world, and artistic experiences are thus essentially exchanges. We experience them as part of our life world and give them their meanings. I want to repeat this strong point, or the point that I want to strongly make. We cannot invent meaning because meanings are existentially grounded in our being human beings on this world. Architectural qualities are constituted in experiencing the work. As philosopher John Dewey argued of works of art in general in Art as Experience. He writes, "By common consent, the Parthenon is a great work of art, yet it has aesthetic standing only as the work becomes an experience for a human being. Art is always the product of experience, of an interaction of human beings with their environments," the philosopher argues. Formal structures and qualities of architecture have their significance in the perceptual process, but they are rationalizing scaffoldings for the experiential and sensory encounter. It needs to be pointed out that even unbuilt projects and architectural propositions, from the mind-blowing spaces of Giovanni Battista Piranesi to Daniel Libeskind's micromegas of late 1970s, can well be imaginatively projected in the flesh of the world, just as any built artistic works. The artistic value of such works is that they are experientially and emotively real. As Alberto Giacometti beautifully says, the task of art is not to imitate reality, but to create a reality that is equally convincing. All artistic works are not symbols or metaphors of something else. They are an authentic experiential reality themselves. All art, in fact, exists simultaneously in two worlds or two realms, that of physical matter and execution on one hand, and that of mental imagery on the other. A painting is paint on canvas, but at the same time it is an image and narrative in the imaginative mental realm. Sculpture is similarly a piece of stone and a mental image. A building is likewise a utilitarian structure and a mental suggestion, a spatial mandala, if you wish. A spatial metaphor of human existence anyway. This dual existence, dual essence and double focus is fundamentally fundamental to the mental impact of art. I had written a sentence like this some months ago when I received an email from a professor friend working in Washington, D.C. on magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. And his message was, Juhani, you are exactly right. In the experience of sacred space, which is similar to the experience of aesthetic space, a strange short-circuiting happens. In that experience, rational understanding is suppressed and emotive is boosted. We do not usually recognize that we actually dwell in architectural metaphors, poetized images, which provide specific frames and horizons for experiencing and understanding our life situation. Again, understanding in an existential sense. Besides, works of art and architecture alter our perceptions of the world. We come not to see the work of art, but the world according to the work, Merleau-Ponty suggests, and I would say to all students and young architects here, learn this idea by heart. That's the task of architecture, is to provide a frame through which we experience the world. Too much today, architecture wants us to look at itself. As Alvarado, this is, by the way, a piece of Alvarado's sketching paper, and it's really exciting to look at it, where the imagining mind focuses between great entities and details, even several projects at the same time. As Alvarado testified above, architectural ideas are not usually born as clear and final forms. They arise as diffuse images, often as formless bodily feelings. They are eventually developed and concretized in successive sketches and models, refined and specified in working drawings, turned into material existence through numerous hands and machines, and finally experienced as purposeful utilitarian structures in the context of life. Yet, even the art of poetry is engaged with the material world and the whole body. Charles Tomlinson, an American poet, points out, painting awakes up the hand, draws in your sense of muscular coordination, your sense of the body, if you like. Poetry also, as it pivots on its stresses, as it rides forward over the line endings, or comes to rest at pauses in the line. Poetry also brings the whole man into play and his bodily essence of himself. The British painter and essayist Adrian Stokes, whose writings are very important, makes the ultimate argument. In a way, all art originates in the body. What I have said so far raises the essential question: how can architectural ideas and aspirations, particularly emotive qualities, emerging initially as immaterial feelings of the designer in the design process, be translated and transferred into the actual building and finally to the person experiencing it? And how can such vague and weakly formalized feelings be communicated? It seems crucial that the designer masters the entire process in order to mediate and materialize her intentions. A talented architect also constructs the entire edifice in her imagination. Every great building has been built twice, first in the immaterial realm of imagination and then in the material world under laws of physics. I must say myself, confess that I make at least 10 projects, variations on each project, so I built 10 different buildings before the actual one is finalized in matter. And every profound building has been imaginatively inhabited by its designer. I inhabit, as I said, a dozen imaginary houses, one after the other, and turn away from them until the final one is conceived. Paul Valéry, probably the finest poet, writer ever to write on architecture, particularly in his dialogues. He writes as follows, and this is, he describes an architect. He gave a like care to all the sensitive points of the building. You would have thought that it was his own body he was tending. But all these delicate devices were as nothing compared to those which he employed when he elaborated the emotions and vibrations of the soul of the future beholder of his work. This is Phaedrus describing